The wind carried a hush across the wide valley, a hush so deep it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to be revealed. On that morning, the horizon glowed with a light softer than silk, stretching over the hills like a painter's brush dipped in gold. And in the middle of that silence stood a man, his hand resting on the weathered rail of an old ranch porch, his gaze searching for a fragment of peace he had chased across deserts and towns, and finally found here, where the world seemed untouched by cruelty. His name was Boone Carter, a man who thought solitude would heal his wounds, that silence could stitch the torn fabric of his spirit. But he didn't yet know that the very silence he clung to was about to be broken by footsteps that didn't belong to any beast of the field, nor any ghost of memory, but to a girl who would change everything. She appeared as if conjured from the forest itself, a fleeting shadow darting between oak trunks, her movements unearthly, like water flowing over stone. For a heartbeat, Boone thought it was a deer, too small, too swift for a person. But then she stood, and in that stand, time froze. Her hair fell in dark, untamed rivers across her shoulders, her body dressed in scraps the wilderness had not yet devoured, and her eyes, oh, her eyes, were a mirror of hunger and fear, yet shimmering with something achingly human. She moved like a whisper of the wild, yet she was not a phantom. She was real, and that reality struck him deeper than any wound. What kind of story begins this way? Not with a kiss, nor a vow, but with the startled gaze between a man and a girl who belonged to neither the human world nor the wolves she had grown with. There was danger in her posture, the kind of danger born not of malice, but of survival. And Boone, though hardened by years of loss, felt his breath falter as if the earth itself had placed her in his path. The air around them trembled, a string pulled taut between caution and curiosity, between the possibility of violence and the whisper of connection. The wolves came soon after, their growls vibrating through the trees, yellow eyes glowing like embers in the half-light. Yet what terrified Boone most was not them, but the way she vanished with them, swallowed whole by shadow, a fleeting presence, leaving behind only the echo of her stare and a silence more deafening than before. It was in that moment that his life began to tilt, not toward solitude, but toward a love written in the language of the untamed, a love that would demand every ounce of his courage. 3 nights later, under a sky heavy with stars, he found proof that she was no dream. Bare footprints circled his well, food vanished from his porch, and strange carvings scarred the bark of the oak beside his cabin. It was as if the wilderness itself had chosen him, as if fate had braided their paths together, strand by fragile strand. And when she appeared again, crouched low, eyes like flares of midnight fire, he realized the truth. This was not the story of a man escaping the world, but of 2 souls destined to collide in a place where healing grows only from trust and love blooms only in the soil of risk. There is something magnetic about the unknown, something irresistible in the pull of the mysterious, and perhaps you, dear soul listening, can feel that same pull now, as if the edges of your own heart are brushing against theirs, as if her untamed spirit and his wounded silence are speaking to the hidden places within you. If these words awaken even the faintest spark of wonder in you, if they stir your heart with the warmth of longing or the sweetness of hope, let it be a reminder to linger a little longer. And if this tale whispers comfort into your soul, I invite you, gently, warmly, to like, to leave a thought in the comments, to subscribe and stay close, because together we can keep weaving these stories of healing and love, where the wild and the human touch in ways that mend. The valley holds its breath still, but now with anticipation, because love has entered the story disguised as a wild girl's eyes and a lonely rancher's guarded heart. And so, beneath the vastness of the western sky, their journey begins. Not with words, but with silence that trembles on the edge of transformation. Silence, waiting to become the music of two lives forever altered. And from this beginning, every step forward will draw them closer, not only to each other, but to the very truth of what it means to belong. The days unfolded like threads of a tapestry Boone had not expected to weave, each sunrise spilling gold across the valley, and each night laying down a blanket of quiet that seemed too heavy to bear. Yet in those spaces between solitude and suspense, there was always the memory of her eyes, untamed, intelligent, frightened, yet daring him to believe she was more than the wilderness had shaped her to be. He told himself he had imagined her, that perhaps loneliness had conjured visions from shadow and silence, but the truth clung to every footprint around his well, every scrap of food gone without a trace, every carved mark etched into the oak tree like whispers of her presence. She was there, and she wanted him to know it. One afternoon, as the sun tilted low, he caught the flicker of her shape again. She lingered behind a boulder, her body curved like a question mark, eyes fixed on him with the patience of a hunter and the vulnerability of a child. He forced his hands to remain steady as he hammered a nail into the fence post, though his heart thundered louder than any hammering could disguise. He wanted to speak, but words felt too heavy, too dangerous to break the fragile moment, so instead he bent, picked up a strip of dried meat from his saddlebag, and tossed it gently toward her hiding place. The offering landed softly on the grass, a gift without demand. Minutes stretched, taut and trembling, before she crept forward on all fours. Every movement was deliberate, her body flowing with a grace that belonged more to the wolves than to people. She sniffed the meat, lifted her eyes once to measure his intent, then tore into it with hunger so sharp it carved itself into Boone's chest. Watching her eat was like watching life fight its way out of starvation, and he realized with an ache that went deeper than pity, he wanted to protect her, not as one might protect a creature, but as a man guards what he secretly hopes could heal the hollows of his own soul. When she finished, her gaze lingered, heavy and questioning. He whispered, "What's your name?" His voice was softer than the breeze, almost stolen by it, but it carried to her. She made no answer, only a sound from deep in her throat, something between a growl and a hum. It rippled through him, unsettling yet strangely melodic, as though she were trying to bridge the language of beasts and men. It was not speech, but it was not silence either. It was an opening, fragile and uncertain, like the first green shoot pushing through hard soil. Then came the riders. 3 of them, their silhouettes cutting across the ridge like shadows of doom. Their horses kicked up dust, their rifles glinted in the sinking light. Oh, the girl stiffened, every line of her body wired with fear. In an instant, she vanished into the landscape, folding into the earth as though she were born of it. Boone felt the emptiness she left behind before he even heard the leader's voice. Sterling Maddox introduced himself with the arrogance of a man who had never been denied, his steel-grey eyes sharp as the knife of his words. They were hunting, he said, hunting something dangerous, a wild girl raised by wolves. They spoke of her not as a child lost, not as a soul wounded, but as a threat to be destroyed. Their words twisted like poison vines around Boone's ribs, and yet he kept his face calm, his voice even. "I haven't seen her," he lied, though the truth was burning against his tongue. But Sterling was not easily deceived. He pointed to the bare footprints near the well, to the marks carved in the bark, his smile a thin blade of menace. He warned Boone, reminded him that in the wilderness accidents often happen to those who protected what should not be protected. The threat was clear: stand aside or be crushed beneath the will of men who carried violence like a second skin. When the riders left to search, the silence that returned was no longer peaceful. It was tense, trembling, as if the earth itself feared for the girl who now fled with hunters at her heels. Boone's chest tightened with a helpless anger he had not felt in years. She was not a beast, no matter how wild her manner. She was a girl, bruised by the hand of fate, carrying scars both visible and hidden, and they wanted to kill her as if she were nothing more than an animal to be hunted. He clenched his fists until his knuckles ached, knowing he would have to make a choice soon, between the safe distance of solitude and the dangerous intimacy of standing beside her. Night fell like ink spilled across the valley. The wolves howled from the far side of the hills, their voices threading through the dark with a music both haunting and holy. Boone lay awake, his body weary, but his mind alive with images of her crouched form, her desperate eyes, her whispered sound that lingered in his bones. He thought of the hunters' cold certainty, of their laughter when they spoke of killing, and something inside him shifted. He had come here to escape the world, but now the world had followed him, carrying with it a test he had never wanted, yet could no longer avoid. At dawn, the mist lay low on the grasslands, curling in silver ribbons. He stepped outside, expecting silence, but found instead the faintest trace of movement near the edge of the clearing. She was there again, wounded by fear, but drawn by need. He met her gaze, held it as if to promise without words that she was safe here, that he would not betray her to the hunters who circled like vultures. She lingered longer this time, her head tilted in that curious, almost childlike way, as if measuring his worth. And in that long exchange of glances, something passed between them, not language, not certainty, but a fragile thread of trust. It was then he realized the truth that settled into him like warmth, spreading through cold bones. He was no longer merely a man hiding from the chaos of the world. He was a man chosen by fate to guard something wild, something precious, something that carried the power to break or to heal. And even though danger prowled just beyond the trees, even though solitude had been his shield, he felt the first flicker of belonging in her presence. The story of his solitude was ending. The story of their entwined destinies had begun. And in that dawn light, with the sound of wolves echoing like a hymn of protection, Boone Carter understood that sometimes healing does not arrive quietly, but comes in the shape of a girl who walks like a shadow, eats like a wolf, and carries in her silence the promise of a love that will one day change everything. The chase began with a rifle crack that tore the morning apart, echoing across the creek and scattering the quiet into pieces too jagged to gather back. Boone had been mending the fence when the sound split the air, but his heart already knew before his mind caught up. They had found her. His hammer dropped, forgotten in the dirt, and his body moved without thought, vaulting the fence, feet pounding against the earth, breath pulling sharp in his chest. Each stride was driven not by reason, but by something primal, an instinct to shield, to protect, to stand between her and the world that wanted her destroyed. The second shot came, closer this time, followed by a curse from the trees. She was still alive. He clung to that desperate thread as he pushed harder, his muscles burning, branches clawing at his clothes. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the raw scent of pine and creek water, the smell of violence intruding upon wilderness. He reached the bank where the water shimmered like broken glass, and saw her there, crouched low behind a fallen log, clutching her shoulder. Blood seeped between her fingers, dark and wet, staining her skin, but her eyes, wild, defiant, terrified, were still burning. She snarled when she saw him, baring her teeth like an animal cornered. Yet beneath the growl was pain so deep it quivered through every line of her body. Boone fell to his knees a few feet away, his hands raised in surrender. "Easy," he whispered, though his voice was barely sound at all. "I'm here to help." She did not understand the words, perhaps, but something in his posture, in the steadiness of his gaze, reached through the storm that consumed her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her strength faltering. He could see the edges of her trust trembling, threatening to collapse. And then the underbrush split open. Dalton stepped out, rifle raised, eyes sharp with the kind of hunger only a hunter could carry. "Hold still, you wild thing," he barked, his voice rough with triumph. Boone didn't think. He threw himself sideways, his body a shield, the bullet slicing the air so close he felt its heat kiss his ear. The girl flinched, her hand tightening over her wound, a soft cry escaping her lips. It was the first sound he had heard from her that resembled human pain, fragile and heartbreakingly real. Dalton chambered another round, his eyes narrowing. "Get out of the way, Carter. That thing needs putting down." But Boone did not move. He stood, tall and unyielding, his arms spread slightly as though the breadth of his body could contain the storm. Behind him she whimpered, low and desperate, and the sound pressed into his chest like a plea carved into his heart. "She's bleeding out," Boone said, his voice steady even as his pulse roared. "She's no threat to you." Sterling arrived then, calm as a predator stalking its prey. His rifle hung ready, his steel-grey eyes glinting with something darker than justice. "Move aside," he ordered. "This ends now." But the girl, this wild child who had never spoken, looked up at Boone with eyes luminous in their terror and hope, and she whispered one word, a word broken, rough, as though her tongue had forgotten how to form it, but still human. "Please." The syllable landed in him like a spark striking tinder. In that instant the world rearranged itself. She was no beast. She was no shadow. She was a girl with a name, a voice, and a trust fragile enough to shatter under the weight of betrayal. Boone's hand slid slowly to his holster, his fingers wrapping around the grip of his revolver. "Don't be stupid, Carter," Sterling said, his tone cold, calculating. 3 rifles against 1. You won't win." "Maybe not," Boone answered, his eyes never leaving Sterling's. "But I don't need to win." I only need to remind you that she's not yours to kill." The forest seemed to hold its breath. Pike shifted uneasily to one side, muttering something about letting Boone tend to her wounds, but Sterling silenced him with a snap of command. The air grew thick, heavy with violence about to be unleashed. And then a howl, low and mournful, rolling across the valley like the voice of the earth itself. Another answered, and another, until the sound swelled into a chorus that trembled through the ground beneath their boots. Wolves, not one, not two, but a pack, closing in with precision. Yellow eyes flickered in the shadows, circling, watching, waiting. The girl, Willa, though Boone did not yet know the shape of her name, lifted her head and, for the first time, smiled. Blood streaked her arm. Her body trembled with weakness, but her spirit rose in that moment. She answered the howl with one of her own, a sound raw and primal, filled with belonging. The pack surged closer, their growls a shield of sound, their presence a wall of living fury. Dalton's hands shook. Pike's courage faltered. Even Sterling's confidence cracked as he realized this was no ordinary hunt. Boone's revolver gleamed in his hand, steady, unwavering, his heart pounding not with fear, but with certainty. He would not abandon her. Not now, not ever. The standoff broke in thunder. Sterling swung his rifle toward her, but Boone's shot came first, slamming into Sterling's shoulder and knocking him back. The wolves surged, not to kill, but to protect, surrounding her with teeth bared, bodies taut. As Sterling staggered, shouting in rage, but his men had already lost their nerve. Pike bolted for his horse. Dalton backed away, pale and trembling. The pack leader, a great silver-streaked wolf, stepped forward, his eyes locking with Sterling's. A low growl rumbled like thunder in his chest, and Sterling froze, trapped by the raw power of nature itself. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice dripping venom. "She's a danger to every decent man in this land, and you'll regret this, Carter." But Boone only tightened his stance, his revolver steady, his body a wall between the girl and the world. "If you come for her again," he said, each word ringing like a vow, "you'd better bring an army." The hunters retreated, curses fading with the thud of hooves, their threats lingering like storm clouds on the horizon. Slowly, the wolves melted back into the trees, silent shadows dissolving into the wilderness. Only the great silver wolf remained for a moment, padding close to nuzzle the girl's wounded shoulder with surprising gentleness, before he too disappeared into the forest's embrace. And then it was only Boone and her. The silence returned. But it was no longer empty. It was full, vibrating with everything they had survived. She looked up at him, her face pale with blood loss, her lips trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice broken but unmistakably human. He holstered his gun and knelt beside her, pressing his hand gently over hers to slow the bleeding. "We need to get you back," he murmured, though she may not have understood. She nodded anyway, as though her soul caught the meaning if her mind did not. When he helped her to her feet, her body leaned into his, fragile and warm, and he realized that his quiet life was over. But as her eyes met his, soft with gratitude, he also realized he didn't mind. Healing, he thought, does not always come as silence. It sometimes comes as wildness, as chaos, as love disguised in a stranger's broken voice. Together they stepped back toward the ranch, two silhouettes against the fading light, carrying with them a story no bullet could end, no hunter could erase. And though blood still marked the earth, something gentler bloomed in its place, the first seed of trust, the first fragile blossom of love. Boone carried her across the threshold like a promise he meant to keep. The cabin smelled of cedar and soap and sun-warmed wood, a quiet refuge built board by hands that needed something steady to hold on to. He laid her on the bed he had intended only for sleep and winter storms and long nights of thinking, and watched it become an altar for something softer. Her shoulder bled through the makeshift bandage, darker at the edges. The moment he let go, she reached for him again, instinct flaring, a tremor in her fingers, as if the room might swallow her without his weight to anchor it. He stayed within her sight, palms open, voice low and even as a stream. He cleaned the wound with boiled water and tincture, the sharp scent of alcohol cutting the air. She bit her lip, eyes burning with a wild shine, but made no sound. When pain crested too high, she turned her face to the wall, like a creature hiding from lightning. He wrapped the bandage with careful hands, small movements, no sudden reach. He learned her language in the way her breath quickened when he stood too fast, the way her shoulders unknotted when he crouched low. He said her name as he tied the gauze, softly, as if it were thread drawn through fabric. Willa. The room heard it. His chest did too. He left the door ajar. The night beyond was a bowl of stars and the smell of damp grass. A low answering circle of wolf song drifted from the tree line, protective, not hunting, and a part of him understood why she flinched less with the door unlatched. The open dark was a kind of mercy. He banked the fire to a warm hush and set water to simmer with willow bark and yarrow. She watched his hands, shadow quiet, following each motion with those luminous eyes, as if learning the map of him as carefully as he had learned the shape of her fear. "Drink," he said when the tea was ready, offering the cup between both palms like a peace treaty. Her fingers brushed his, light as a moth wing. She sniffed, frowned, looked at him to read if this was trap or kindness, then took a careful sip. Bitter, then softer. She grimaced and kept drinking, jaw set like a soldier's. When she finished, he smiled without teeth, a small curve that meant safe. Her gaze softened, just enough to let him breathe. Days unfurled in quiet ribbons. The wound knit slowly, each sunrise a stitch. In the mornings he changed the bandage. In the afternoons he showed her the paths of the ranch, the well with its cool iron crank, the corral with its patient posts, the oak whose bark held her old carvings like a diary kept by a forest. He spoke sparingly, not to fill silence, but to lay stepping stones across it. "Water," he said, touching the bucket's rim. "Bread." He broke a loaf and handed her half. "Knife." He set its handle on the table and stepped back. Each time she repeated, rough at first, then truer, as if the words were seeds placed on the tongue and asked to grow. Willa favored the shadows where light came fractured and gentle. She moved barefoot across the floor without sound, all sinew and breath, learning the edges of the room like a skittish deer learns the edges of a meadow. She would pause at the window and raise her head just slightly, listening for tones he could not hear, then relax when a code the wind carried, told her all was well. Sometimes she crouched by the hearth and watched fire like it was an animal learning to be tame. One evening she reached out a fingertip toward the flame and pulled back quickly with a hiss. Boone took her hand in both of his, cooled the heat with damp cloth, and her eyes went bright with shock. At the pain first, then at the fact he'd taken it from her and held it without harm. He learned her smiles, not the wide, easy kind of town women on church steps, but the rare, startled bend of lip that appeared when an idle sparrow landed on the rail, when cream frothed in a tin cup, when he mispronounced a word from the little primer book he'd found in a trunk, and she, of all people, corrected him with a small, triumphant sound. He brought her a dress, plain blue, soft cotton, and set it on the back of a chair without ceremony. She watched it for a long time, eyes narrowed like a tracker reading unfamiliar scat. The next morning she was wearing it, the hem ragged where she had cut away the parts that felt too heavy. He laughed quietly to himself at the sight, and something in her shoulders eased, as if the house itself had exhaled. Storms rolled over the valley and rinsed the world clean. During one, rain drummed the roof like 100 fingertips, and thunder muttered low. Willa stood in the doorway, face to the downpour, not stepping out, not stepping back. Boone set a blanket around her shoulders, not to hold her, but to offer warmth, and in that wool-soft hush she leaned a fraction toward his chest, just enough to be a choice. He could feel the quick flutter of her breath as the sky flashed, then calmed again. He thought of how healing often arrived like this, not by miracle, but by a steady presence at the threshold. When the rain passed, the wolves came quiet to the edge of the yard, their paws dark with mud. A great silver male, the same from the creek, Boone felt certain, stood like a pillar in the thinning mist. Willa stepped to the porch steps and lowered herself with reverence, making a sound he had no name for, part greeting, part gratitude. The wolf's ears flicked. He answered in a breath-deep whine, then sat, regal and at ease. The others ghosted between nettle and fern, curious and content. It struck Boone that nothing about this was domination, it was kinship. They had not come to claim her. They had come to witness that she was claimed by care. That night, by lamplight, Willa found the little mirror tucked in a drawer. She stared, as if meeting a stranger who had borrowed her face. She touched the scar at her shoulder, a pale crescent now, and then traced the line of her jaw as if remembering the delicate arithmetic of being human. Boone busied himself with beans and salt pork to give her the courtesy of not being watched while she looked. Still, he felt it like weather, her grief for what had been lost, her wonder at what had been found. When she set the mirror down, she spoke without turning. "Willa?" "I know," he answered softly. "Willa?" She nodded once, satisfied not at his comprehension, but at the way he said it, as if her name had weight and warmth in his mouth. Then she tilted her head the way she always did when curiosity uncurled, pointed a finger to his chest, and asked, almost too quietly, "Boone?" "Yes." She tried it again, rounding the vowel as if rolling a small stone in her palm. "Boone." The sound found a home between them and stayed. He told her, piece by careful piece, the story of why he'd come to the ranch alone. Not the ugliness of it, only the shape. A town too loud with grief, a betrayal that thinned his faith, the need for distance so silence could be medicine. She listened the way wild things listen, to tone, to weather in the voice, to the places words did not go. The wind nudged the curtain, the lamp hummed. When he stopped, she touched the place over her own sternum, where hurts go to sleep, and said one word softly, "Heal." He closed his eyes at that, because there it was, the benediction he hadn't known he'd needed, spoken in a voice that had learned language again just to give it to him. Mornings acquired a rhythm. Boone saddled the mare and checked fence lines while Willa sorted herbs she found along the creek, comfrey for bruises, plantain for bites, yarrow for bleeding. She taught by gesture, press here, wrap this way, and he took it in with gratitude that felt like awe. In return, he showed her the small economies of human life. How to measure flour by cupped hand when scales go missing. How to mend a shirt with ladder stitches so fine they held like secrets. How to take a breath in anger and let it leave through the nose without violence. Together they built a language stitched from two worlds, the naming of tools and the naming of winds. Sometimes fear woke her from sleep, sudden and ruinous. She would sit bolt upright, eyes black as the midnight window, chest heaving, a sound at the back of her throat like the edge of a howl. Boone would not touch her then. He would light the lamp, speak her name like honey in tea, and count slow with his breath until hers matched the pattern. When calm returned, she would lower her head in that peculiar half-bow that meant, "Thank you," then lie back down, one hand open on the quilt as if to say, "See, I am not hiding claws." He would sit in the chair and listen to the crickets write their patient music, and the room would feel like a sanctuary both of them had prayed into being. On a day clear as glass, they walked to the far pasture. Grass shivered in silk waves. Willa's bare feet darkened with loam. Her blue hem swung like a bell. At the fence line a yearling approached, ears forward, brave and naive. Willa stilled, then dropped her gaze, turning her body sideways, the horse's language for peace. The colt stretched his neck, nostrils flaring at the salt of her skin and the foreign of the soap she'd learned to use. When his velvet nose touched her wrist, her mouth opened slightly, and Boone felt the world tilt, such a small, ordinary grace, yet it slipped something gentle into both their chests. For a long moment nature held still between them, not to be tamed, only to be trusted. That evening Boone taught her a game with cards, numbers and suits, hearts and spades, and she learned it like she learned everything, by watching, then by doing, then by winning with a glint of delighted mischief. When she laid down the last card and grinned, quicksilver, shy, triumphant, he laughed aloud, the sound surprised out of him like a bird lifted by wind. It echoed against the beams and made the house feel brighter. Willa's victory smile dimmed into something softer, as if the light had settled somewhere new behind her eyes. He felt the shift the first time she reached for his hand without fear. They were on the porch after supper. The valley, a wide bowl of dusk and low cricket hum. A chill braided through the air. He started to rise for another blanket. Instead, her fingers found his. Not desperate, not trembling, simply present, warm, human. She looked at their joined hands as if someone had told her a secret and she had finally believed it. No words for it. None needed. The quiet around them grew tender, and in that tenderness he sensed the fragile acreage of what might come next. Affection ripening into love, not by fire, but by steady weather. Healing, not as sermon, but as shared breath. One morning they baked. Flour dusted her hair in pale constellations. She dipped a finger in the honey jar and pressed the sweetness against his lower lip, testing if generosity could be play. He whooped like a boy and pretended offense. She laughed, a sound so bright it scattered the day's last shadows. Later, she scribbled on scrap paper with a dull pencil, drawing the long slope of the valley, then two small figures side by side, stick-sure but unmistakable. Beneath them she wrote a word carefully shaped: home. Boone had never been a man to cry easily, but his throat tightened and his vision blurred, as if the land itself had moved closer to say yes. He nodded, because his voice was not trustworthy, and Willa's eyes gentled with pride at having named a thing that had until then only been felt. By then the scar on her shoulder had faded to a pale half-moon. She wore her hair in a loose braid. She taught herself by trial and error, and sometimes she would sit on the porch trimming it with a knife, not to tame it, but to tend it. Boone caught himself watching her the way a thirsty man watches rain, grateful, astonished it has chosen this ground. He did not reach, though. He let the slow ache of admiration do its quiet work, trusting that closeness, like bread, rises best when not rushed. Signs of the outer world began to return. Hoof-prints too many for a stray traveller, a cigarette butt ground into the dirt near the lower gate, a broken twig that had no wind's handwriting on it. Boone said nothing at first. He walked the perimeter at dawn, shoulders squared to a horizon that had for a while felt safely empty. The wolves kept their own counsel, but they showed more often at twilight, a grey punctuation along the tree line, neither threat nor omen, simply presence. Willa read the wind and knew before he told her. She set a palm on his chest, over the heart, and waited until she felt the rhythm answer her with steadiness. "Sterling," he said finally, "because names matter." Her pupils widened the way a deer's will when the brush whispers of danger. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. She turned her face toward the hills and breathed the air, tasting it the way the wild do. When she looked back, there was no plea in her gaze, only the certainty of a vow already formed. She would not run from this life again. They prepared without ceremony. Boone checked the hinges and mended weak boards. He loaded cartridges with patient hands. Willa wove dried herbs into small bundles and tucked them near doors and windows, not as magic, but as memory, sense of places where she had survived. He taught her how to hold a rifle, not to fire, not yet, but to understand its weight and its line. She rested the stock against her shoulder, closed one eye, and grimaced, not from fear, but from the knowledge of what tools men choose when they forget how to listen. He set the gun aside and showed her the lasso. She laughed at his clumsy first loop, then fixed it with a flick of wrist, the rope's arc catching late sun like a halo. On the last evening before the sky changed its weather, they ate on the porch steps. Apples sliced thin, cheese, the last of the summer peaches turned to jam. Willa leaned into his shoulder lightly. Boone pressed his cheek to the crown of her head and let the quiet carry them. In the half-dark, coyotes yipped far off. Somewhere a nightjar stitched its call through pine. The world did not feel frightened. It felt awake. They did, too. When the first rider's silhouette darkened the ridge at dawn, Boone was already standing, his boots laced, his hat brim low. Willa stood beside him, sleeve rolled high, the pale crescent of her healed scar catching a blade of light. The wolves shifted like smoke along the margin of the trees, neither seen nor absent. Boone glanced at her, and she met his eyes with a calm that had taken root in the weeks between terror and now. He reached for her hand. She took it, and together they stepped off the porch into the new day, into whatever would be asked of their courage and whatever would be given back to them for the giving. The hoofbeats grew clearer, a drum the earth could not ignore. Dust lifted, voices carried. The old world approached, convinced it could decide the shape of theirs, but the valley had learned new music, and two hearts had learned to keep time with it. The wind slid over the grass with a sound like a blessing. Boone tightened his hold, not to keep her, but to stand with her, and Willa lifted her chin, a wild grace shining through the human she had chosen to be. Together they walked to meet the riders as the sun broke the horizon, and the morning opened like a door. The riders came down the ridge in a wedge, sun tilting off their rifle barrels, dust rising around their horses' legs like smoke from a slow fire. Sterling rode at the point, his sling banded across the shoulder Boone had torn with a bullet, his jaw locked so hard a vein beat at his temple. Dalton kept his eyes on the tree line, remembering the wolves. Pike, younger than the others, and already older than he should have been, glanced from Willa to Boone and tried to make sense of a scene that refused to fit inside his fear. Boone didn't step back. He and Willa stood at the break in the fence, where the ground turned from yard to open land. Her hand was in his, quiet, not clinging, as if she'd chosen a center and was learning its weight. The wolves were only whispers in the brush, shadows with lungs, but their presence sifted through the air like a promise. Sterling drew his horse to a halt, the animal's breath steaming in the morning cool. "You should have taken the easy path, Carter," he said, voice raw gravel. "Kindness makes fools of men." "Or makes them men," Boone answered, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. "Depends what you do with it." Sterling's stare slid to Willa and stuck there. He seemed to be searching for a monster he could aim at. He found only a girl with a healed scar, a braid laid over one shoulder, a blue dress that moved when the breeze breathed. Her gaze met his without flinching. There was no ferocity in it, not now, only a steadiness that told of dark nights endured and a dawn chosen. "We're not here to jaw," Dalton muttered, but his voice lacked the iron it had carried at the creek. The valley itself felt different, like a church when candles are lit. Pike rubbed at his neck, eyes flicking to the thicket where the wolves kept counsel. "Boss?" Sterling ignored him. "You can pretend she's tame," he said to Boone, slow and careful, like he was placing the last plank on a gallows, "but the wild don't learn to kneel. They break, and when they break, they bite." Boone lifted his head a fraction. "She's not a dog to be broken. She's a person who was left to survive." Sterling's reins creaked in his hand. "A person tore a bull's throat out. A person runs with wolves and calls them like a horn, calls men to war." Willa took one small step forward. Boone felt the movement in his palm like the first note of rain. She didn't look at him for permission. She didn't look away from Sterling either. "Hungry," she said, voice roughened but clear. "Long time. No bread, no fire, no hands." She tapped at her chest. then her mouth. Hungry turns teeth to knife. The words struck Sterling harder than any bullet could have. Language placed her squarely inside the circle he'd drawn around humanity and kept guarded by fear. The tightness around his mouth shifted, but if there was a crack in him, he hid it. Dalton's horse tossed its head. He soothed it with a mutter. "We could just walk away, boss. Nothing here we got to fix." Sterling's side-eye cut him to silence. "We don't walk away from danger just because it learned to say please." He leaned forward in the saddle, weight pitched toward the fight he thought he wanted. "Here's what happens. She leaves. Now, far from here, far from folks. She leaves and stays gone, and you stay alive." Boone shook his head once. "No." "Then I make it happen." The air tightened. A hawk wrote a slow figure 8 over the field, and for a hushed beat, even wind forgot its work. Willa's fingers shifted, not in fear, he could feel that, but in memory. She remembered pain. She remembered the creek. She remembered her own blood running into water the color of sky. Boone let go of her hand and stepped forward so Sterling had no horizon to look at, but the breadth of one man and the line he meant to hold. "This is a ranch," he said evenly. "A home. I won't be dragged out of it by a man who confuses order with cruelty." Sterling's mouth twisted. "You call what she brings home?" Willa's voice, barely above a breath. "Home." She touched the dirt with her toes, small, precise. "Here." Pike's gaze snagged on the movement, bare feet against earth. A woman naming a place not with maps, but with skin and steadiness. Something beached in his eyes softened. "Boss," he said again, quieter, "it ain't right." Sterling's horse sidestepped. He gathered the animal with a sharp jerk. "You two got loose spines today." He let the word hang like a spit in the dust, then nodded at the tree line. "You think those wolves will nest in your children's cribs if she whistles sweet? That's what mercy buys you." Willa turned at that, slowly, like a tide. She looked toward the brush and made a sound that was neither call nor command. It was a murmur of reassurance, a tone that told the pack the measure of the moment. Leaves trembled, then nothing. The forest remained a patient listener. "They come for me," she said, facing Sterling again. "No house, no crib, no children?" There was no bitterness in her voice, only the truth, carried like water. "No harm, if no hunt." "You don't speak for wild teeth," Sterling snapped. Her chin lifted. "I can." Boone watched the words change the mathematics in the men's heads. If Willa could hold the wild in conversation, then what they feared might be handled by dialogue rather than death. Even Dalton could do that math. Sterling felt the calculus slipping from him. He tried another angle. "You think folks will bring you bread and sugar, Carter, when they hear you took in the thing that scared them. They'll scorch your fields with gossip first, then with fire if the gossip doesn't burn hot enough." "I didn't come to this valley to be fed by folks," Boone said. "I came to grow my own life, and I'll keep growing it with the truth as my fence line." Something in Sterling's posture flickered, an old fatigue, maybe, or a memory of someone he had once been before. Fear recast him like an iron ingot. He pulled in a breath and let it out slow, as if tasting a choice. For a heartbeat, Boone saw the man under the weaponry, the one who might have chosen a plough once and didn't. but watching men save themselves is a rare mercy. Sterling's jaw locked again. Pike, Dalton, circle those outbuildings. If she bolts, shoot to lay her down. No one moved. Boone did. He stepped closer, not with bravado, but with clarity. "There's an easier way," he said. "You want safety. So do we. We set terms, we set distance. You leave this fence alone. We keep the wolves to the trees. You hear of harm, you come ask first, not with rifles, with your tongue." Sterling stared as if he'd been offered a language he didn't want. He swung down from his saddle, boots cutting small scars in the dirt, and walked until he and Boone could feel each other's breath. "You drawing papers like a judge?" he said. "Out here, a man signs with what he's willing to bleed." Boone's mouth softened with something like pity. "Then that makes us kin, doesn't it?" Sterling's injured shoulder tugged a wince from him when he shifted. Pride tried to swallow it. Pain forced it back up. He glanced at Willa again. She hadn't moved, but she felt nearer, as if the space between her and the rest of the world had been learning, day by day, how to be bridged. He looked past her to the house, cedar and lamplight, the small rituals of care stacked like cordwood. A life. It had been easier when she was only a rumor. Harder now that she was a person wearing blue. "That bull," he said, not quite meeting Willa's eye. "Was it you?" Willa's throat worked. "Hunger," she said again, and this time it was not a defense, but a confession. "I am sorry." The word shook, not because it was a lie, but because it cost something to carry. "I did not know another way." Sterling stood very still. The apology hung between them like a cord cut from both ends, not tethering, simply falling, and thudding in the place where judgments land when they're done dancing. Something old in him sighed. He wasn't done being cruel, but he was tired. Dalton rubbed his jaw. "She said sorry, boss." He shrugged, like a man laying down a sack of rocks no one had asked him to carry. "Sorry doesn't sow a bull's throat," Sterling said, but the fletching was gone from his arrow. "No," Boone replied, "but it can lay the needle out on the table." Wind moved through the grass. The hawk finished its figure and disappeared. Pike shifted in his saddle again. Then, with a breath that sounded like a boy remembering a kindness, said, "We got other trouble down valley anyway. Flood took half the east fence. Folks will need hands more than they need fights." Sterling looked at his men, at the line Boone and Willa made with nothing but bodies and breath, and a quiet that refused to be bullied. He spat once, not at them, but at the ground. The closest thing to a surrender he could stomach without breaking his teeth. "You fenced yourself to a storm," he growled to Boone. "When it blows, don't say I didn't warn you." Boone's answer was simple. "We'll weather it." Sterling hauled himself back into the saddle with a grunt that scraped embarrassment off the moment. He tugged the reins, wheeled, and the wedge of men turned with him. They rode out the way they'd come, a little faster than pride would have liked, a little slower than fear would have begged. At the ridge, Sterling cut a final look over his shoulder. It wasn't hatred that burned in it, not purely. It was the ache of a man who sees a door he cannot walk through and calls it a wall. When the dust settled, the silence that rolled over the ranch was the soft kind, the kind that sets a hand on your shoulder and means it. Boone let out the breath he'd been holding and felt himself shake once, a tremor passing like weather. Willa slipped her fingers back into his, thumb tracing the inside seam of his knuckle. "Strong," she murmured, and he couldn't tell if she meant him or the wind or the earth that had held both. They didn't go inside right away. They kept standing in that threshold space where threat had been and peace had returned, where you can listen to the ground remind you that you are still here. The wolves eased out of the brush, uncoiling one by one like prayer ropes. The great silver male approached the break in the fence and sat, head tilted, eyes tracking Willa. She made a small sound that pulled a line from her throat to his, and the knot that had lived there ever since the creek loosened another fraction. "Come," Boone said after a while, not as an order, but as an invitation back into ordinary grace. He led her to the porch steps and sat. She followed, folding into the space beside him as if the wood had been planed for the shape she made. He poured water into a tin cup. She drank. He set bread between them, and they ate with the quiet abundance of those who have known hunger and are not afraid to taste heaven in small things. Later, he saddled the mare, and they checked the lower gate together. Where Sterling had planted his threat, Boone set a new hinge. Where hooves had gouged the earth, Willa patted the scars flat, and the ground accepted the apology. When a meadowlark trilled, Willa answered with a whistle so gentle the bird tilted its head like it had been greeted by its own reflection. Back at the house, she took down the little mirror again. She looked at herself a long moment, then at him. "Different," she said, touching her face, then his. "We." The word did what lightning does when it finds a high place. It lit everything without burning it down. He nodded, because speech was too narrow to carry what rose in him. He stepped closer and lifted a hand toward her cheek. She didn't flinch. His fingers brushed the soft edge of her jaw, a touch light enough to leave the door open, warm enough to make the room bigger. She closed her eyes, not to hide from the world, but to bear witness to the world of feeling that breath brings when safety is in the room. They moved around each other for the rest of the day, like two rivers learning how to merge without flooding. She hung herbs to dry above the door, a fringe of green blessings. He repaired a loose board, humming without noticing. When their paths crossed at the basin, their shoulders touched, and they both paused, letting the contact register as fact, not accident. Toward evening, the sky laid pink silk over the valley. Boone lit the lamp, and Willa stood at the threshold with the open dark behind her, neither inside nor out. He joined her, and they watched night arrange itself gently on the hills. "They will come again," she said, not afraid, only truthful. "They might," he agreed. "So will we." She turned the words over, found their sweetness, and set them beside her store of good things. "So will we," she echoed, learning how hope tastes in the mouth. They ate peaches and beans and a corner of cheese and didn't make plans so much as promises in the shape of habits. He would teach her the winter stars. She would teach him what every wind means when it changes by a hair. He told her where the river goes when the rain fattens it. She told him how wolves grieve and how they forgive. He told her how to read a letter even when you don't want to know what it says. She told him how to listen to silence until it tells you the truth. When sleep came, it came like a quilt pulled by a mother's hands. Willa lay on her side, hair a dark current on the pillow. Boone sat in the chair again, not because he was afraid she'd wake afraid, but because part of him liked to guard what he'd been given. He watched her breathe and felt his own body match it. An old miracle, the one we forget when we're busy surviving. Outside, the wolves sang a thin, silver song, not sad, not fierce. A hymn, almost, for the two-legged who had learned their names and answered without trying to own the wildness that had carried those names here. At dawn they rose. The valley smelled of sage, and the cool that lingers just before the day declares its heat. Boone handed her a pair of boots, worn soft. She slid them on without protest, no longer because he wanted her to, but because she had decided she liked the way the earth felt through leather when chores took you across thistle and stone. He laughed, the small kind that means thank you, and she offered him the last of the early berries she'd gathered, staining his fingers with purple remembrance. On the table, Willa laid out the dull pencil and drew again, not the valley this time, but a line of riders on a ridge, and below them a small house and two figures at the fence. She pressed harder, darkening the points where their hands met. Beneath, she wrote two words, careful and proud. Stand, stay. He looked at the drawing, then at her. That's the plan, he said, and it wasn't a plan so much as a vow that fit both their hearts. The day stretched ahead, full of work, fences to walk, wood to chop, a life to tend. The storm Sterling promised might come, or it might break up on the hills and pass them by with only a little rain to sweeten the dust. Either way, they had chosen the same ground. When they stepped outside, the light held them like a blessing. The wolves were gone, but not far. The hawk wrote another figure 8 and vanished toward the river. Somewhere, across miles they could not see, men gathered their angers like kindling. Here, in the middle of a place that had learned their names, two people set their shoulders to the same wind and moved forward together, not to outrun what waited, but to meet it with the calm of those who have already stepped through one fire and found on the other side that love is not a blaze to consume, but a hearth to return to. And as they crossed the yard toward the lower fence, with the smell of cedar and warm bread still stitched into the air, the morning opened again, asking nothing and offering everything, and they answered by living. Summer thinned into a gentler heat, the kind that ripened berries and set the river whispering under willow shade. Work found its rhythm again, mending, tending, small restorations that knit the day to itself. Willa rose earlier now, drawn by the cool, the birds' silver threads of song. Boone would step outside to find her on the porch rail, one knee up, braid undone, watching the valley breathe like she was learning its pulse and offering her own in answer. Sometimes she would hum, a low, travelling sound that seemed to walk the fences before they did. He didn't always recognize the melody, perhaps there wasn't one. It was the feeling that mattered, that soft tincture steeping the morning. Healing, he thought, was not a finish line you crossed once, but a practice, the repeated act of showing up where the hurt had been and laying down kindness like a road. There were days he forgot to be afraid and only remembered to be grateful. On one such day, clouds stood up tall to the west. Not storm towers yet, just messengers. The air was different, full of water, taut like a string tuned a half-tone higher. Boone felt it in his bones like old weather waking. He touched the brim of his hat and scanned the tree line. Willa stole a glance at his face and then at the sky. Something in her shoulders answered a rhythm he couldn't hear. "River," she said, as if the word itself were a warning and a promise. "We'll watch it," he answered. "We'll be ready." By noon the wind had changed. Not a gale, more a steady persuasion from the west, and the hawk stayed lower than usual in its long, slow patterns. The scent of rain arrived before the sound. Then the downpour came, not in anger, but with conviction, straight lines of water knitting earth and sky. They pulled the shutters half closed. Willa stood in the doorway and let the cool mist kiss her cheeks. The wolves ghosted at the tree line, slower, less curious, as if respecting the sky's work. Boone checked the lower field first, then the farther fence where spring runoff liked to test his carpentry. Willa tied her hem and followed, moving sure-footed through slick grass. They walked the fence like you walk a boundary in yourself, hand trailing the rails, checking each join, each knot, listening with fingers. The creek that ran along the far pasture fattened and darkened, its voice deepened around the stones. Somewhere down valley, Boone thought he heard another voice, the low, troubled rumble of the river rising where it bends. They met Pike at the old cottonwood that had, for as long as anyone remembered, held the business of the valley against one side of its trunk like the long, weathered face of a ledger. He sat his horse soaked through, hat dripping, eyes shifted from the joking boy Boone had first seen into a man trying to hold two truths at once. He tipped his hat to Willa, not completely without awkwardness, then nodded to Boone. "East Bank, up and mean," he said. "Bell Farm already lost their bottom rows. If the fence goes, the cattle'll run for higher ground and break a leg somewhere that'll make a child cry. Folks need hands." Boone answered by swinging up onto the mare. Willa's eyes flicked to him, to the water, to Pike, to the wolves poised like commas, waiting for a sentence to be finished. "Come?" she asked, almost like a child asking to climb a tree, but her body spoke the older language of purpose. He studied the current, the way it had changed the color of the world, and nodded once. Pike's jaw worked like he was chewing a problem, but it was a day for more mending than worrying, and he knew it. "If she can keep to the bank," he said, not quite looking at Willa, "we can use every pair of good feet." They moved as a small, determined caravan. Boone, Willa, Pike, behind them two wolves at a distance like shadows with opinions. The rain softened and then hardened by turns, sometimes a curtain, sometimes a veil. The river showed its teeth where it tore at the outer bend, gnawing at willow roots, riling up old logs like bones the water had decided to remember. At the Bell place, neighbors ran like their names depended on the speed of their hands. Children hauled rail ties like they were hauling sails for a ship, faces fierce and proud. Mrs. Bell stood in the doorway with a baby on her hip, issuing orders that wove logic into panic. Boone swung down with a "ma'am," and Willa dipped her head in the subtle half-bow she gave to women who were keeping entire worlds upright. The fence at the far end didn't need arguing. It told its own story. A span had given, rails pushed over by a tree that had fallen shy of the river and then realized its mistake. Men with ropes shouted over the water, pulling in one rhythm, then another. The cows weren't foolish, but fear had a language too, and they were nosing toward a gap they couldn't read as ruin. Willa didn't wait for instruction. She lowered herself to a crouch at the high side of the gap and began to move, not fast, not slow, with the precise economy of someone convincing something nervous that all will be well. She made a low sound, not the wolf's wild call, but a soft coaxing like creek talk over stones in autumn. A red and white heifer rolled an eye at her, then took one uncertain step back from the brake. Another followed, annoyed at being told no by a voice that shouldn't have authority and somehow did. Pike blinked, then grinned in spite of himself. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, not unkindly. Boone waded in knee-deep at the outer edge, rope around his waist, looped the other end to the stump of the downed tree. "On my count," he hollered, and felt 10 hearts behind him shift into the same beat. The river hauled like a mule, the rope sang, the tree budged, jerked, slid, and finally tore free into the current with a groan that sounded absurdly like relief. He smiled up at her, and she smiled back. Not triumph exactly, more like the inward glow of someone who has chosen a side and found her strength useful. "Good," she said simply. "Good," he echoed, taking the rope, and the word was a blessing between them in the wet. They worked until their hands stung and their shoulders remembered what they were for. When at last the rain gentled and the river loosened its jaw, neighbors drifted into clusters of relieved laughter. Someone brought out bread that had miraculously survived the weather. Someone else produced a crock of marmalade, like a party had been hiding under the bed, just in case survival needed celebrating. Pike stood near the fence post and studied Willa the way you study a map to a place you thought you weren't allowed to go. When he finally spoke, he did it with his hat in his hands. Willa rode behind Boone, arms around his waist, cheek against his back, not to hide from the world, but to side with it in a way that had become comfortable. The river kept talking, but at a volume that let the land answer without panic. At the cabin, they hung their clothes by the stove and sat in shirts that steamed as if they were fresh from some kind of baptism. Boone poured coffee strong enough to lean on. Willa wrapped her hands around the cup like they could catch every ounce of warmth and store it under her skin. On the table lay the pencil and scraps of paper she liked to draw on. She pushed one toward him, the fence line, thick strokes where it had been tested, a small herd of uneven cows with noble eyes, a braid drawn with a few careful lines, a rope taut and held by many hands. Underneath, she wrote slower than before, choosing each letter like a stone you place where you want someone to step. Together. They ate soup while their boots dried, the kind that tastes better because the day has earned it. He told her the names of the Bell children. She told him the scent of the river when it is about to turn mean. He showed her how water leaves lines on the bank the way time leaves rings on a tree. She showed him how wolves teach their young by letting them watch without scolding. Later, when the sun worked its slow way down and lit the underside of the clouds in a rosy promise, Willa stood before the mirror again. Her hands moved to her hair with the same patience she now used to learn letters: loop, cross, tuck. "I go to town," she said suddenly, eyes on her reflection, as if trying the thought on like a borrowed shawl. Boone imagined the mercantile, the angled looks, the salesgirl with a tight mouth and generous heart, the boys ankle-deep in mischief. He imagined Sterling like a rumour in every corner. He turned the idea over slowly. "We can," he said, when the silence felt like it needed a word to hold it open. "But only if you want to, your timing, your pace." Willa held his gaze in the glass, then turned to face him directly. "I want," she said. The sentence fit her. It didn't sound like a demand. It sounded like a life waking up to its permissions. They chose a day with no weather in its pockets. Boone sharpened coins from under the sugar tin, folded a list into his vest: salt, lamp chimneys, twine, needles, coffee, a book, if there was one, with pictures of birds. Willa braided her hair and hesitated only a heartbeat at the boots before sliding them on with a small nod to her future. The wolves watched from the tree line like relatives not invited to a ceremony they understood was meant for humans. The road into town was more ruts than road, but the mare knew its stories. Willa took in everything: the way fences give up and begin again, the lines of wash strung between porches like flags of ordinary bravery. When they topped the low rise and the cluster of buildings huddled into view, she reached for Boone's hand without looking at him. He gave it and didn't let go until her fingers loosened on their own. People looked. People always look when they don't understand, and sometimes they look when they're trying so hard to understand they forget to be subtle. Mrs. Dugan, behind the counter, had the good sense to let her face do nothing except welcome. "Morning, Mr. Carter," she said. Then, "And you must be Willa." She didn't make a question of it. She made a place for the answer in her voice. Willa breathed in the sharp cinnamon of the candy jars, the dust of flour, the faint iron tang of nails in a barrel. "Morning," she said, and the word came out like a shell, polished by wave after wave. The Bell children were there with a wedge of coins and a list like a dream. Sugar if we can, thread if not. Tell Mrs. Dugan we're sorry about the mud. The little girl who had clapped at the river stood on tiptoe to look into Willa's face and said, with the brutal gentleness of children, "You saved our cow." Willa's mouth opened on a small O of surprise, then curved into her rarest smile. "We saved," she corrected softly, tapping the child's shoulder, her own chest, and the air around them. The child accepted the edit with solemn pride, like receiving a new rule for a game that had just gotten better. Outside, Pike leaned against a post, boot heels scraping a rhythm on the step. He lifted his chin in a greeting that had no grudge bottled in it. "Flood did more talking than Sterling can shout," he said, just for Boone. Then, after a moment, "He'll be back. He don't like to lose the last word." "I don't care who gets the last word," Boone said. "I care who tells the truth." Pike studied Willa through the window, where she picked up a book and held it like something live. "Truth is, things are different than the stories we wrote to scare ourselves." His mouth twitched. "That's harder to admit than I figured." Boone followed his gaze. Willa turned a page and made a soft, pleased sound when she found a bird she recognized. The nuthatch, toes splayed, small and clever. "You coming around the lower gate tomorrow?" Boone asked. "Yeah," Pike said. "I'll help you set a brace that won't pout at the first tantrum of water. Heard Sterling scouting north. Don't know if that's bluster or weather. Either way," he straightened, "I'll be here." Boone wanted to clap him on the shoulder and didn't. Some bonds are like calves in spring. You let them find their legs without crowding. "All right," he said, and the words landed simple and sincere. They rode home with a sack heavier than money, but lighter than worry. Willa cradled the bird book like it might spill if jostled. When a gust tugged at the pages, she smoothed them down with a palm as gentle as a vow. The wolves met them at the turn by the dry creek bed. Willa made a sound Boone had learned meant it was a day for peace, not a hunt, and the pack shifted into a loose escort, present without pressing. That evening, lamp lit, they sat side by side and traced birds with their fingers. "This one," Willa said, tapping a raven with ink-black wings spread. "Smart." She kept tapping. "Trickster. Grief friend." Boone smiled at the last unexpected hyphen. He lifted her hand and kissed the knuckle beside that finger, not a claim, not a question, just the kind of touch that says, "I'm here, I see, keep going." She did. "This?" A meadowlark. Song healer. "This?" A hawk. Watcher. "This?" A small grey shape. Home. "You're learning a whole grammar of wings," he said. She leaned into him without thinking, her head finding the place under his jaw like a bird finds the same branch each dusk. "You teach letters," she murmured. "I teach wind. We write together." He rested his cheek against her hair, and in the warm quiet he felt time do that slow, generous thing it sometimes does when you are exactly where you're meant to be. It didn't rush. They didn't hear Sterling that night. He was nowhere in the wind's report, neither in the coyotes' yips nor the barn owl's banked flight. But the knowledge of him remained like a pressure change, a front you can't see, but your bones prepare for. Boone stacked kindling, filled the water bucket, ran his hands over the rope until the fibers felt familiar as an old hymn. Willa tucked a sprig of yarrow above the door and made the little mark on the wall she'd been making since she arrived. A crescent, a line, a dot, her untranslatable script of shelter. When they slept, it was not the nervous sleep of hunted creatures, nor the heavy, dreamless sleep of the exhausted. It was the soft middle, the kind that lets healing slip into the body while no one's looking. Wolves sang once, and then let silence do the rest. Morning came cool and new. The river had settled into its wider self, satisfied for now with what it had taken and what it had spared. Boone woke with Willa's hand open on his arm, an easy tether. He watched her breathe twice and then slid free to set the coffee on. She joined him at the window in her blue dress, bare feet quiet, hair unbraided. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, and watched light spill into the valley. He showed her the line of riders on a far ridge, only two, moving like men who wanted to be seen enough to be counted and not enough to be questioned. He didn't say Sterling's name. He didn't need to. Willa lifted her chin and breathed in deeply through her nose, tasting the morning. "We stand," she said, as if anchoring the words to the floorboards. "We stay," he answered, tying the rope of the day to its post. He reached for her hand, and when she slipped her fingers into his, there was no tremor, no question, just the warm certainty of people who had built a small, brave life and were willing to spend all the gentleness they had to defend it. They stepped out onto the porch, and the world looked back with its wide, wild eyes, neither enemy nor pet, simply itself, ready to be met with care. The wolves were there, a soft grey punctuation along the trees, and the hawk wrote its patient figure over the pasture like a signature. Boone touched the brim of his hat, Willa touched the threshold, and together they walked into the day opening before them, not as fugitives of the past, not as beggars at the future's door, but as keepers of a present they had chosen, willing to answer, again and again, the quiet call that had saved them both. Come home. The riders on the ridge paused, turned. One lifted a hand as if shading his eyes or offering a small, reluctant salute. Whether it was warning or recognition, Boone couldn't say. He only knew the next chapter had turned itself over without asking permission. He glanced at Willa, and she met his look with that steady, dawn-lit calm he had learned to trust more than any promise. They went to the lower fence together, where the day always began, where the valley kept its oldest conversations, the place where love proves itself by work, and work keeps love warm, and the light gathered them like a secret the mountains were delighted to keep a little while longer. Dawn slid like pale silk over the hills, and the world woke with the soft discipline of those who have learned to be gentle with what they love. Boone woke with Willa's hair across his shoulder, a dark river warmed by sleep, and for a long, unhurried breath he let the quiet complete him. Then the day, as days do, asked to be begun. He rose, set the kettle, stoked the fire until it spoke in small, pleased crackles. Willa came to the table barefoot, the blue dress brushing her calves, eyes steady with the sweetness of having slept without fear. She touched his arm, and the room brightened, as if the window had remembered a pane of light it had meant to keep. They ate bread warmed on the skillet, drizzled with honey that turned the morning to amber. The bird book lay open beside the plate, the page with the meadowlark turned up like a promise. Willa tapped the illustration and said, "Song healer," with a tilt of her head that made the words feel like a blessing left on the threshold for anyone who needed it. They listened. From the pasture, the true bird answered, stitching sunlight to air with a thread only joy knows how to spin. On the ridge, hoofbeats counted once, twice, then stilled. Boone's chest tightened, then loosened as the sound drifted off toward the north. Not today, then. Not yet. He laid a hand over Willa's where it rested on the table, and she turned her palm to fit his as if she had been made with the exact negative of him in mind. They chose work that made the heart quiet, scraping the last of the spring paint from the barn door, sanding until cedar showed its own warm grain. Willa ran her palm over the smooth boards and closed her eyes, like someone reading a beloved's face in the dark. Boone whistled a tune he half remembered from a childhood that had kept its sweetness like a pressed flower. The mare nosed Willa's shoulder for a carrot and received both a carrot and a laugh. The laugh left a glow that lingered, the way lamplight lingers on hands that have just finished a prayer. Near noon, a shadow crossed the yard. Pike, hat in his hands, not riding in hard, but soft as a thought a man has been rehearsing so it lands right. He stopped at the break in the fence and looked at the two of them, the way someone looks at a house that did not exist a year ago, and now seems it could never have been otherwise. "Morning," he said, and the word wore a new coat. "Bellboy's fever broke. Mrs. Bell says to tell you the poultice you brought was a miracle wearing leaves." Her words. Willa's mouth curved. "Leaves heal," she said, and the sentence made a small, proud place in the air. Pike nodded. "They do at that." He shifted, the news that wanted out finally pushing to the front of him. "Saw Sterling 2 ridges over yesterday. He's been talking to folks who like to solve questions with powder." A wince, an apology. "He's gathering a notion of law, is what I'm saying. Paper and pen with a grudge in the ink." Boone wiped dust from his palms and met Pike's gaze without flinch. "We expected that weather." "I know." Pike's fingers worried the brim of his hat, then gentled it as if remembering that care is the better habit. "I'm not here to tell you to run. I'm here to say you won't be standing alone when that paper comes looking for a wall to nail itself to." He glanced at Willa with a shy gravity. "I ain't much good with speeches, miss, but I can turn a man's boot if it crosses your threshold without a hello." Willa studied him like she studies wind, then nodded once, a slow, sober benediction. "Together," she said. The word had grown a backbone in her mouth. They walked the fence line with Pike that afternoon, not because it was broken, but because it mattered to be seen about the business of peace. The wolves kept to the trees, a grey punctuation. They crossed near the cottonwood ledger and found Mrs. Dugan's hand there in flower-white chalk. "Bread fair, Saturday, proceeds for flood families." Beneath it, a child's scrawl with a crooked heart. "Thank you, Willa Boone." Willa traced the letters slowly, whispering them as Boone named each curve, each brave attempt. She touched the heart last, then pressed her palm to her own chest and smiled. "We," she breathed, not as grammar, but as truth. The fair drew them to town like a tide pulls boats that have learned to read the moon. Willa wore the blue dress and a ribbon Boone had brought home in a paper twist, green as new willow. He tightened the cinch and checked the mare's hooves twice and then one more time, because taking care was the work that made him most himself. The ride felt easier than the first. Fields had been set back to order. Fences mended, rumours of Sterling's temper circulated like a wind that had lost its map. Town was a soft roar, voices, fiddles, children running with the ferocity of joy. "Mrs." Dugan pressed a paper cup of lemonade into Willa's hand and then straightened the ribbon with a quick, motherly touch. "Welcome," she said, and made the word a chair with a cushion in it. The bell-girl tugged Willa toward a table stacked with pies and held up a sign she had lettered herself. "We mend what water tried to take." Willa read it aloud, each word a small victory, and the child grinned so wide it looked like sunrise. They bought coffee beans and needles and a slate for practicing letters. Willa traced her name with chalk as if she were pressing it into wet clay, and smiled at how it held. Willa, simple, true. Boone bargained badly for a second-hand shawl he pretended was a poor weave to keep the price low. The old woman at the stall saw what he was doing and lowered it further with a wink that made him blush. Willa wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and laughed when it smelled faintly of wood smoke and lilac. "Story," she said, lifting the fringe to her face. "Another woman's winter, now mine." Pike drifted close at the edges like a good guard who knows not to crowd. Dalton hung back across the square, hat low, chewing at the corner of his doubt. He lifted two fingers in a greeting that didn't know how to be whole yet, and nodded once when Boone returned it with a calm that meant, "We remember you could have done worse and didn't." The moment turned on a hinge of quiet. Sterling stepped out of the marshal's office with a paper in his hand and something stiff inside his spine that hadn't been there the last time Boone looked him in the eye. He scanned the square, saw Willa, and the hunger that moved in his face was not the clean hunger of work or bread. It was the kind that confuses safety with control. He took 2 steps and then spoke a name not his. "Marshal." The marshal followed, a decent man with shoulders that sagged when the world asked him to pick a side where he would have preferred to stack crates and keep the peace with coffee and presents. He held the paper like a skillet hot from the fire. "Boone," he said, not unkind. "We got a complaint signed by 3 men with land along the North Fork. Says the girl's a threat. Says cattle been lost and blame laid. Says—" He swallowed the last, ashamed of it. "Says the law ought to keep order." Willa stood with her shoulders square, eyes clear, chin lifted in a way that made Boone think of young trees that bend and do not break. He reached for her hand, and she gave it. "Marshal," he said, "you've seen our work. You've seen her work. Ask Mrs. Bell about order. Ask the fence lines we put back where the river asked too much." Mrs. Bell did not wait to be asked. She was already crossing the square, apron flapping like a flag that wouldn't be told to fold. "My boy's alive because she knew how to pull the fever out with leaves," she said, pointing at Willa, as if anyone in doubt needed an arrow to follow. "And my cows are on dirt, not in water, because that man," a sharp chin toward Boone, "wrestled a tree like it was a bad thought and moved it along. If that's disorder, then print me a new dictionary, Marshal." Laughter, thin at first, then warmer. People do not always know the rightness they are carrying until someone names it. Pike stepped up beside Mrs. Bell, hat in hand, because respect belonged to somebody in every conversation. "We stand with 'em," he said, "and I'll sign that on whatever you've got handy." He took the marshal's paper and wrote his name at the bottom in a blocky hand that looked like someone building a bridge. Dalton crossed the square like a man hoping not to be seen by his own worst habits. He stopped beside Pike, spit in the dirt, not to be rude, but to clear his mouth so the truth could come through. "Me too," he said. "I ain't much for speeches neither, but we saw who shot first and who covered a body that wasn't his with his own. I don't forget that kind of thing, not when it's my life they could be aiming at next." The marshal's face changed, the relief of a man being offered a way to be better than his instructions. He folded the paper slowly, as if it were a letter he could answer with silence. "Sterling," he said, sad to be right and tired of the cost, "seems to me the valley has decided the shape of order for itself." He tucked the paper into his jacket, like losing it might be a form of grace. "I'm not serving this today." Sterling's jaw pulsed. For a heartbeat, Boone saw the boy in him, barefoot in a creek, sling in hand, trying to hit a tin can and missing because he was laughing too hard. Then the door closed. Hard. He stepped in toward Willa and Boone, too close for the square and the children and the lemonade and the music. "You think this is over?" he hissed, grief hidden under anger, the way a broken bone hides under skin. "You think a loaf and a fiddle wipe teeth clean? She's a storm you've parked your house under and called shade." Willa took one small breath, and then the gentlest step forward Boone had ever seen a person take into another's weather. "I am learning," she said, her voice a river when it is full but not angry. "Hunger taught me teeth. People teach me hands." She lifted hers, palms out, empty, unarmed. "I will not bite those who feed me. I will feed too." The square listened. Sterling didn't know what to do with a person who refused to be the thing he had built his certainty upon. He had 1,000 arguments for a monster. He had none for a woman who offered to carry the bucket. He turned with a curse whose bite had dulled and shouldered back into the marshal's office, slamming the door hard enough to shake the window. No one followed. The fiddles picked up again, faltered, then found the tune. Life always has a way of insisting. Boone let out the breath he'd been holding and felt Willa's hand squeeze once. A pulse of living. Mrs. Bell touched Willa's shoulder with a palm that lingered, the way women bless women without ceremony. "Come by the house on Sunday," she said briskly, voice still fierce. I'll show you how to put up peaches so you've got summer in February. Don't let the men have all the heroing." She smiled at Boone to soften it. Boone took the nudge like a man grateful to be included in a world that made sense. They did not leave right away. They stayed until the lanterns were lit, until Willa danced a slow circle with the bell girl to a tune that sounded like smoke and cinnamon, until Boone remembered how to relax his shoulders in public without asking permission. Pike bought a paper cone of candied nuts and pretended he didn't mean to hand it to Willa. She pretended she didn't notice his pretending and took two, and then tucked the cone into Boone's vest like a secret. They rode home in a dusk that felt earned. The wolves appeared at the bend like ink notes in the margin of a beloved book, keeping pace without intrusion. The wind was low and kind. Willa laid her cheek against Boone's back and said, so soft he almost thought he dreamed it, "Safe." And the word made his throat ache in the good way, the way water aches when it finds the stone it has been carving for years, finally smooth enough to rest upon. At the cabin, the lamplight opened like a welcome.